Okay, great. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thanks for your patience, those of you who joined early on. So I'm really excited about introducing our two speakers and also introducing the topic for today. It's a very relevant topic. It's a topic that hasn't really been explored too much. So I think it's something that you'll certainly find of interest and relevance. It's not a long webinar. We'll be done in the next 30 minutes or so, but we do encourage everyone to please ask questions throughout. If there's anything you don't understand or any questions you do have for the speakers throughout the webinar, please use the chat or the Q&A feature in Zoom. The topic is around the importance of securing storage and backup as the kind of last line of defense. We found that a lot of CISO's effort in managing ransomware risk is really directed towards prevention and detection, as opposed to securing storage and backup environments. And we believe this is a glaring blind spot, since the working assumption should be that some attacks will succeed. And when that happens, storage and backups are the last line of defense. And the question we're going to ask ourselves is, are they secure enough? And today's session will cover new ransomware trends and the evolving data threat landscape. And our two speakers will address the myths of storage and backup protection, and also give you some best practices for better ransomware resilience, as well as for storage and backup security governance. Our two speakers today are John Meakin. John is currently a cybersecurity advisor working with many large enterprises. He was also the former CISO at a number of large organizations, including GlaxoSmithKline, BP, Deutsche Bank, Standard Chartered Bank, and others. And John is joined by Doron Pinchas. Doron is the CTO at Continuity, and he's also the co-author of the recent NIST guide entitled Security Guidelines for Storage Infrastructure. It was published at the end of last year. I know Doron will reference it a couple of times throughout the webinar, but it's an excellent piece of guidance and advice to help you build your strategy for storage and backup security. So without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to let Doron take over from here.
Thanks for the intro. My name is Doron Pinchas. I'm the CTO with Continuity Software. And with me, we have John. John, why won't you take over the next slide and introduce yourself?
Yes, so thank you, Doron. So my name is John Meakin. I am a CISO of about 30 years standing, having spent 18 of those 30 years working in banking for banks such as Royal Bank of Scotland, Standard Chartered, and Deutsche Bank. And today we're here to talk to you about data and data storage and the security of storage. Now, obviously, data has been part of my role as a CISO over many years, but I think what we'd like to talk to you today about is something that perhaps isn't so obvious to many CISOs like myself, and I'll admit that even for myself, it was not a focus of my work up until quite recently. So we want to talk about the big picture of securing data storage. We want to give you our view that perhaps this is a Cinderella area in the pursuit of security of businesses. And we want to talk a little bit about myths and reality. It's backed up by a great survey that Doron will talk more about later on. And then we'll give you some thoughts about how you can rise to that challenge, how you can get prepared. And where do we go from here? Where does the world of business and securing business go in pursuit of good, secure data in support of business? So obviously, it'll come as no news to any of you that actually security today is as much about data as it's ever been, because actually data is what's suffering at the hands of those malicious actors who are launching ransomware attacks on us left, right, and center. And you know, it really is the threat du jour. It is the subject of newspaper headlines, and you can see some of them here. But there's an interesting context to ransomware because it is focused on data, because those with malicious intent, organized criminals, whoever they are damaging our businesses by attacking the data, by locking that data up, making it unavailable to us, then of course, at the nexus of that threat is the need to secure that data in storage. And I think, if I think about my career as a CISO, as I said at the beginning, it's been all about data for many, many years. But of course, 20 years ago, we thought about data in files, and files were a construct in an operating system, and an operating system was something we logged directly onto. Of course, the data storage infrastructure world today is very, very much different. And the criminals know that. And so you can see from this new story that actually the criminals recognize that, because they're in this to make money, and they have money to buy expertise, and that expertise realizes that actually, given the way data storage is delivered these days, there are other ways of attacking us that maybe we haven't been looking hard enough at. And that's despite, of course, everyone talking about this. Gartner, you can see the quote from Gartner. And we tend to think about the final protection against ransomware being backups. But of course, backups are just another blob of data in storage. So if the storage mechanism isn't secure enough, then your backup's not worth the data that's written into it. And indeed, I think in my own experience, I'll recognize that actually reliability of backups has always been a bit of a variable. It's even more a variable now if we can't say that the platform for that backup is itself secure. And of course, testing your backups is no good if the backups aren't there anymore. So yes, the Biden administration is putting out some really great advice and great support to not just government, but industry in the matter of rising to the challenge of ransomware. But are we really focused on the right thing? Isn't there, in fact, a gap along a number of lines that we want to talk a little bit more about today? Data is the lifeblood of all of our businesses, more so today than any other time in human history. And yet, are we really rising to the challenge as those attacks get more sophisticated, as the attacks target maybe those darker parts of our infrastructure, which we, the security experts and our IT colleagues, haven't spent enough time focusing on it? And why am I sitting here saying this today? I'm saying it because actually so many of these attacks are succeeding. And in fact, if you want proof of that, real hard proof, other than the attention-grabbing headlines, just look at the market for cyber insurance. You look at actually large insurers beginning to pull out of that market. And why are they pulling out of it? Because it's no longer good business for them, because there are so many claims that are being made as a result of ransomware attacks, where the ransom is being paid. And the ransom is only paid really if you haven't got the data anymore, not even in your backups. So there's a degree of proof in the pudding there. Doron, what do you think about this?
Yep. So I'd love to share in the next few slides some of the misconceptions we encounter when we talk with customers, right? So, and that perhaps maybe starts to explain why attacks on the data plane tend to succeed, John, as you've so well described. So often when we open up discussion with concerned organizations, and maybe ones that have been hit, we'll first encounter beliefs such as, well, storage is so obscure, backups are buried within the bowels of the data center. Why do we need to bother protecting them? And the reality is that storage and backup systems are not so obscure, right? So you can readily obtain lots of information about the architecture of backup and storage. You can easily download virtual appliances and build your own storage lab, what used to cost millions in the past, and you can easily put your attention to attacking them. And there's a surprising number of ways to get in, from the most obvious social engineering perspective, right? So if you run a large financial service organization, probably your team is connected to LinkedIn. A quick survey can show who are their friends within the vendor ecosystem. And, John, if you are a storage admin at a large financial services. I can pretend to be Doron, your sales engineer from whatever, one of the wonderful vendors, and send you a fake email, of course, saying, hey, John, I know you've been interested in whatever, storage reporting. Here is an amazing tools we've just put on our cloud environment. Can you just take a look? You click because you trust me, and now I'm inside your PC. And the storage admin's PC probably can have access to your consoles, and maybe you haven't hardened your sessions. Maybe you didn't enforce session timeouts. Maybe you're using cached credentials. Maybe you even use the default storage username and passwords provided by the vendor. All of these are things we see. But of course, hackers can also get in from many, many different ways. Some of your systems might be, and you won't be aware of that, connected to the internet. They may have control paths that are mapped to your DMZ servers. They may have backdoors from the vendor sites that you didn't really think of locking or securing. And so don't bank on the fact that storage systems cannot be hacked. In fact, it can be very easily done. And I'll provide some links later on in today's session. Within our website, there are quite a number of examples. And also, we often hear that, well, you know, if something does happen, I have backups, right? So, you know, I can recover. Now, John, as you have pointed out, why do so many organizations choose to pay the ransom if they have backups? And the truth of the matter is that backups are much more complex than what most security professional would imagine, right? Because the traditional tape system and even disk-based systems are relatively slow to recover. So organization will deploy a multi-tiered approach. They'll have storage-based snapshots for ultra-quick recovery that they rely on, and these can be attacked just as well as the storage devices that contain them can be attacked. And they also have secondary copies in the form of replication, and usually they don't really separate duties and roles. So the same server admin role can maybe even access the replicas, and so they can be corrupted as well. And even the backup systems themselves are susceptible to attacks, especially if you don't separate the duties well enough. And I also hear about people engaging modern technology, which are great, by the way, for immutable copies that supposedly prevent attackers from deleting certain backups. But you should be really careful in designing them, because even immutable copies are susceptible to strategies such as poisoning. There is an interesting video on our site that shows you what you need to consider when you start using those technologies. And finally, we also hear from customers that they've been spending a lot of attention in threat detection and analysis and vulnerability management. So perhaps there's a little left to do with storage. And again, the truth of the matter is that storage systems have their own protocols. Fiber channel networks are not IP networks. Their management consoles are hardly ever audited and monitored live, and are hardly ever connected to your vulnerability management, threat detection, intrusion detection, and even data loss prevention systems. So for example, there is an interesting interview with a hacker I've seen not a long while ago, where they explained that, you know, if you don't secure APIs, or if they can pretend to be your vendor rep, they can chip in, get into the data management plane, and ask the storage devices to present a copy of your data to them, to a non-secure lab environment that's set up within your environment. So they can, in theory, exfiltrate data completely under the radar, because the storage network and the backup networks are hardly ever monitored. There's also a very good resource I'll show you a link to a little bit later, with a survey, technical survey we've run, that outlines some of the most common misconfigurations organizations make in storage and backup systems. You may want to check that out and share it with your team, just to make sure that you're doing the right things. So that was the technical reality. John, does it ring any bells? Does it sound familiar?
It certainly does, Doron. I mean, you know, actually the journey I went on in recognizing how the storage platform is a separate world that needed as much attention as the compute platform and the network platform. Was actually, it started with cloud. And I'm sure you all know, of course, cloud is normally a separate, cloud storage is normally a separate service offered, you know, whatever your favorite cloud platform is. And thereby, with that comes separate risks. So you could talk about, you know, S3 storage in AWS and you know, the access keys. And there was a period maybe 6-7 years ago when searching for unprotected access keys was every hacker's favorite pastime, and therefore they were able to get at the storage regardless of what the compute infrastructure in the cloud was doing, regardless of what the application was doing, to protect itself. And actually that started me thinking about, well, okay, what about on-prem storage and what about hybrid cloud on-prem storage? And the truth is these are separate systems, but for various reasons, which I think we'll come to in a moment, they haven't had that same attention historically, either from ourselves as security experts or indeed from our infrastructure colleagues. And so I'll give you a great example. You know, in response to the ransomware threat, one of the things that I've been doing in recent years is pushing the vaulting of privileged access, taking privileged access away from day-to-day use, putting in a secure vault. It's only available when you need it and only after time by time or case by case authorization. Guess what gets missed out of that process of vaulting? The credentials for the storage platform. I've seen it happen 2-3 times. So yeah, I think, you know, what you're saying, Doron, is really picking at some real myths in current thinking that arise from that blind spot we've had historically.
Right. Thanks, John. So just one final aspect before I hand it back to you. I want to just share with you another resource that you'll find on our site, which is a recent survey just got published last week, where unlike the previous one I mentioned, which really dives into the technical details of storage vulnerabilities, here we wanted to examine how well our organizations prepared from the awareness perspective, from the process perspective, how confident they are that they can recover, and how well do they think they cover storage, backup, and recovery means within their organizations. And we were surprised to find that around 2/3 of the responders believe that in today's infrastructure, an attack on their storage systems, on backup, on data could have devastating effects, significant or catastrophic impact on their organization, yet around 60% are not confident they can recover from such an attack, which presents a huge gap. And also an interesting trend, I think, John, you mentioned that on your first slide, that regulators start paying much more attention to organizations' obligation, and especially in the financial sector, to protect their data assets. So about 2/3 of the responders mentioned that in their recent external audits that governments and regulators and partners regularly run, they've been asked specifically about the measures and means they utilize to protect storage. And so, you know, with those dissonant facts, right? So data is important, yet it's not well protected. We understand it could be devastating, yet we don't really feel confident we're securing it well enough. And all of that from the CISO perspective, I wanted to ask you, John, maybe to talk a little bit about the process angle, what it is that we're missing out, and what's your take on potentially getting a better future?
Yeah, so where do we go from here? And, you know, there's a danger. I'm going to teach you all how to suck eggs here, because, you know, these 4 stages you see in front of you here are not by any means entirely original. And you could say this is what every CISO does every time a new threat type comes up. But I think, you know, we have catch up to play here. If you believe what Doron and I have been saying, we have to play catch up. So we need to go through these steps to get everyone aligned to begin to tackle this problem. So these 4 steps: education. Education because actually there is a lack of common understanding. Both I could talk for my own experience and my fellow CISOs. There's a lack of understanding the ins and outs of how storage actually works these days. There are, after all, about 10 different types of storage platform available these days. So we need to go through that education, but we also need to educate our colleagues working in IT infrastructure in charge of storage, in as much as they need to recognize the security risks. And so they need to actively manage security on those platforms. So getting those guys to come to the table is the necessary first stage for sure. We then, of course, need to go through that definitional phase. Doron quite rightly pointed out, there are some unique protocols that relate to some of those different types of storage platform, and we need to learn about those, and we need to define what is good security in relation to those types of protocols. Then, of course, we need, the rubber needs to hit the road. We need to implement, and hardening storage platforms should be seen as exactly as valuable and as important in pursuing secure business as hardening your Windows servers, your Linux servers, your cloud VMs, etc. And then finally, we obviously need to look at that target of secure online storage platforms as being something which needs active, ongoing risk management. The threats won't stay steady, won't stay still. We know that's a truism of security, and so we need to manage that risk on an ongoing basis. Really obvious, perhaps, 4 steps to success, but what's perhaps less obvious is the content here. And one thing that I would call out above all else is you need to reach out and have that common understanding that there is a real problem here between yourselves and infrastructure operations and anyone else involved in managing and supporting the storage platform, including indeed some of the vendors. Achieving that common agreement that there's a real problem to solve here is the biggest step forwards towards success. Doron, are there any other things you can think of that might help our community tackle this problem in an effective way?
Yeah, sure. And also in the interest of time, so there is quite a lot to say. If there is one thing more I want to maybe talk about really briefly, is a recent security guide that has been published by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We are extremely happy at Continuity to have been able to aid in formulating this guide. And yet it does provide a very thorough overview of the current storage technologies. What are the risk landscapes, which, it can be quite illuminating because not every security practitioner truly understand all the aspects of storage security, and it's a very good resource. But I think the most important bit is in the technical section 3 and 4, that outlines how to minimize the attack surface and provide very actionable advice on how you can build an effective program and what controls you should consider adding to your program to have better security outlines for storage and backup systems. And of course, there is plenty of other good material in our site. We've seen we glimpsed a number of those, which is the technical survey across industry that shows what are some of the most common misconfigurations and lots of practical advice on how you can check that you're immune, and if not, what is the significance of those. The CISO survey and many other resources you can find at our site. And with that, and in interest of time, I think it's a good time to move to the Q&A session if you have any.
Fantastic. Thank you, Doron. And like you mentioned, if you do have any questions, please use the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll get to your questions as soon as possible. So we'll give everyone a couple of minutes to gather your thoughts and get your questions through. So one question that's come through so far from John. So Doron, John wants to know exactly how ransomware can impact a NAS device. Can you perhaps elaborate?
Right. So actually in a number of ways, right? So let's start with the fact that NAS devices are often based on proprietary versions of known operating systems. Some of these are Linux, very hardened kernels, but yet they are susceptible to evolving attacks. So for that particular reasons, vendors will regularly publish CVEs for NAS devices. And if these are not patched, then obviously attackers might find ways to exploit vulnerabilities and find administrative capabilities in. So one way of getting into your NAS devices is by identifying unresolved breaches. And this is a very common threat, but there are many other ways to get in. For example, even if no known vulnerabilities exist that haven't been patched, you still need to make sure that your NAS devices probably have central authentication and management enabled and configured properly. It's a very bad practice, and we see that happening often, that people rely on local admin accounts. Heaven forbid, even sometimes when we help organizations map their risk landscape, we'll find that the default factory accounts that have been provisioned by the vendor for their NAS appliances haven't been changed. It's also important when you consider NAS devices to realize they might have variable functionalities. So it's not just about storing files to a huge number of clients, which means, by the way, that attackers can use NAS devices to propagate malware throughout their organization once they're in. NAS devices are also sometimes the targets for backup. So in a lot of cases, people have their tier 1 backups on snapshots and the next one on disk. But these will rely on NAS volumes or NAS archives or NAS snapshot vaults. So there are different aspects where, if your NAS are not hardened enough, they are not restricted enough, potentially even not disconnected from the vendor side, because there are support links enabled by NAS vendors sometimes that might allow external access. You may want to get those closed. You may have reason to keep them open, but then if you do that, you want to make sure you initiate the sessions and not the vendor, and that you restrict the client list. So there is a variety. I can come up with a few more angles, but NAS devices present a huge attack surface. Because they contain vast amounts of information in one place that can be used to propagate ransomware toll, and because they have multiple ways of controlling them, either through central management, local users, through writing content, through exploiting backdoors, and so on. So hopefully that touches upon somewhat has been asked, and I'll be happy to be more specific.
Fantastic, thank you. And one final question, Doron. What role, this is from Harry, what role do the immutable storage play in protecting against ransomware?
Right. So in my personal view, immutable storage is a tremendous innovation in storage security. We've seen that roll out both in cloud environments as well as on-premise. So more and more vendors, thankfully, allow us to configure portions of the storage service as being retention locked or protected from writes for a specific amount of time or forever. If configured correctly, then backup sets that are written to immutable storage cannot be tampered by attackers, even if they manage to gain access to our servers and even to our storage systems. The problem is that people tend to have myopic view of, once they have purchased the license for immutable storage, that everything is fine, but that's not that easy. First of all, we have to actually activate the immutable storage, set up a reasonable retention policy. And if we don't want to do that carefully, then one of the easiest things hackers can do is time zap attacks, right? So they can persuade the array that enough time has lapsed and the array will voluntarily delete snapshots. Or if we don't control snapshot delete options on time, then attackers, once they start encrypting the actual content of the storage array and a huge amount of data gets replaced, then snapshots grow and grow. And eventually, if our retention policy is not careful enough, then the array itself will delete even the immutable copies. So it does take careful enough planning and deployment. But if we do that correctly, then yes, immutable snapshots can be a tremendous aid. Finally, I should say that it also must be combined with proper auditing and change control, because there is also a growing risk of there are tactics that attackers can deploy, even if immutable storage is deployed perfectly, to actually poison not the copies, but the backup process itself. Just in a nutshell, assume that you don't audit your backup environment and changes frequently enough. An attacker sees that there is no way to corrupt the actual copies you have right now, but they can actually change the backup job today, looking forward. So today, your backup is not perfect anymore, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. So they just have to bide their time. If you're not testing your immutable copies frequently enough, if you're not testing the current copies, then when enough time has passed, they will attack. And at that time, you'll find that you have no recent copies. Your only viable copies are probably months old. So immutable copies are amazing technologies. If you've purchased them, you should definitely configure them correctly. Pay enough attention to the relevant best practices. Take advice from the NIST guide to make sure you've checklisted everything you should to know that you're utilizing this technology in a safe, secure, and effective way.
Great answer. Doron, thank you so much for your time. And John, I know you had to leave early. So thank you to John. Thank you everyone for joining us. I did add in the chat the link to the NIST guide that Doron mentioned earlier. This is called the Security Guidelines for Storage Infrastructure. It's a great resource. I know Doron touched on it very, very briefly, but there's a lot more added value in the guide. I encourage everyone to go and check it out. In the meantime, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you in the next webinar.
Thank you very much.